At the start of this, I opened the floor up for questions. We had a couple of questions to start with, which I think have possibly been partly answered in the panel discussion, but I don't think we touched on the UHF issue that was raised. I don't know if any of the panel have anything that they would like to say on the UHF issue and the possibility of IMT entering that band. Martha?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I would address the two questions. The first one was about UHF agenda item 1.5, and the second one was about IMT in the upper 6 gigahertz band agenda item 1.2. So you were asking like which are our insights from the DSA. So first, it's always, and it's in your hands. I mean, you are the authorities, you are the regulators, you are the ones who decide. And every decision starts from a policy perspective. Which are the goals that you have as countries? In the case of broadcast, it's very relevant for many countries because that's the way they are creating the content, they are communicating with people. And in many parts of Region 1, there are also engagements, long-term engagements for services. So at DSA, we have been working on TV white spaces, as it was mentioned yesterday. We are promoting more spectrum for Wi-Fi, but both of those technologies are license exempt or unlicensed. So they are not a primary service. So in the discussions about that at WRC, we are discussing about radio regulation services. So that's why the discussion is always mobile with an IMT identification versus broadcast. TV white spaces doesn't have a place there because it's not a service, it's a type of usage of the band. And then about the 6 gigahertz band, the discussion is about satellite and fixed service sharing with mobile under IMT identification. So, and that's the way it is. However, any decision about an IMT identification will have an impact on the market. So if there is an IMT identification for the upper part of the 6 gigahertz band in Region 1, that's sending a message that those countries making that decision won't be aligned with the global trend that we are seeing and the momentum we are seeing for Wi-Fi in the 6 gigahertz band. So what is the risk if that happens? Applications that require large bandwidth and that require many available channels will be limited. So that sounds like not a big problem if you are just one user and you have the priority of the access in a single place. But that's very critical for industry applications where you have different devices operating at the same time that need large bandwidth in order to provide high throughput and low latency. But it's also important for congested areas. And what I have heard in these last 2 days is that there are many applications of that type. So when you have different users that can access the internet, they need performant Wi-Fi. So it's a policy decision. Do you want to limit the quality of the Wi-Fi that will be provided? Because if we don't have enough channels, then the quality, Wi-Fi will continue operating, but just not with the large bandwidth that is needed, but with lower bandwidth. And then you can provide throughputs of, 2 megabits per second, 5 megabits per second when you have number of users together instead of gigabits per second. So it's really a policy decision, and it's in your hands. Another aspect is that agenda item 1.2 for the upper 6 gigahertz band is just under discussion in Region 1. And that is because the administrations decided that way. So we are seeing more and more messages saying, let's wait and see, but that's only for that agenda item. So we think that the probabilities of having IMT harmonization in the 6 gigahertz band are very low, because we know that many countries already decided to use that band for license-exempt access, and that comes because they want to protect fixed service and fixed satellite services that can coexist, as it was mentioned by Gisela. So just some considerations there.
So thank you for those thoughts. Was there anything more that any of the other panel members wanted to say on that? And just from the perspective of Ofcom in the UK, we've obviously, as Martha said, we've been considering the policy on what to do, particularly with upper 6 gigahertz, and it's not an easy question. And we issued an update on our views on the agenda item and the band for WRC 23 just before Christmas, where the UK are not in favour of an IMT identification. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't think the band could be viably used for mobile services. We do think that, but we also think that there's also a good opportunity for license-exempt services such as Wi-Fi in the band, and we're worried that an IMT identification in Region 1 would send a very strong message that might preclude low-power license-exempt use. And what we want to try and do is foster or explore options where perhaps both, IMT and Wi-Fi could share the band under some sort of sharing arrangements and mechanisms that would enable the benefits of both. Now, that's difficult because it requires the cooperation of the two sets of industry communities, but it's something that we in the UK think is worth exploring. I just thought I'd put that context there, so you know where the UK is on that. But I'd be very interested in any other views from the floor on either of those two issues, or if there are other questions that ministers have for the panel. Yes, right at the back. Have we got a microphone?
Thank you very much for the good presentations. I've heard speakers talking about the spectrum for Wi-Fi and the mobile. I haven't heard anything to do with FM broadcasting, which is one of the challenges that we have in the part of Africa, that we've run out of the spectrum, and I don't know whether at WRC there will be a discussion whether to expand the band or not. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you for that question. I'm not sure whether any other speakers want to pick up on that point.
No, I apologize, probably I was not very clear on that. I just say that the discussion is about the primary services, broadcast and mobile under an IMT identification, but DSA doesn't have a particular position there, because even if we have supported TV white spaces, it's always a secondary way of using spectrum. So it's not really, and even we had, maybe as a context, long time ago, there was a position that say, TV white spaces is going to create pollution of the spectrum, and that was the term used. But we have seen that administrations that decided to open UHF bands for TV white spaces and then decided to repurpose portions of the band for IMT, it happened very easily. I think UK was a great example when they had the 700 megahertz auction. They just updated the available channels in the database, and that's how it happened. It's also probably related to the number of deployments, but when we're talking about dynamic spectrum access tools, it's not pollution, because you heard that term many times. Even if it is unlicensed, there are rules in place that are decided by the authorities that manage the way that those devices or any type of systems access the spectrum. Some countries call it general licenses, which I find personally appropriate, because it's not like an anarchy. There are rules that should be respected. But as DSA, we don't have any particular position for agenda item 1.5.
Did that answer your question? I think you were referring to FM broadcasting. So
Sorry.
So FM sound broadcasting. In terms of discussion at the World Radio Conference at the end of the year, I don't think there's scheduled a discussion on FM broadcasting on the agenda at least, and therefore that's something if there is a need that will need to be considered potentially for a future conference. Any other questions? Yes.
This is a question to Dr. Martha. I was just wondering on your views on the future of C-band, because I understand that WRC 19, there was a discussion on IMT Advanced and C-band. So I was just wondering how your views on it, given that it's a very important issue in the Pacific Islands. So I wonder what the future holds for C-band.
Yeah, thank you. I think on that discussion, it's about, well, there is one agenda item that is more about the mobile service as a primary service, and the other one about IMT identification. DSA doesn't have a particular position on that, but I show some slides about flexible frameworks. And I was speaking in that presentation about some segments. Like I mentioned, Europe has been considering 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz for broadband access, or some other examples like the US using the 3550 megahertz to 3700. All those applications are done already in bands that have been allocated to mobile service. And even if they're flexible frameworks, they are at the national level. So they decided, authorities that have decided to create those frameworks are, again, at the national level. So they respect the allocation of the band, they respect the usage, and indeed they benefit from economies of scale, because if those bands are used for mobile applications, then you have devices available. But those frameworks are not exclusively for that band. So if a particular regulator decides to use a flexible framework in a frequency band that is already available, let's say for commercial networks, identified for mobile and allocated for mobile and identified for IMT, they can do it. It doesn't have to be exclusively in one band. So that's just to answer your question. Indeed, spectrum sharing and dynamic spectrum access is very flexible. There are many colors and flavors. It's not like, you should do it exactly in the same band. You should do it just with the services, because it really depends on the local context and local needs.
Thank you. Did Christopher or Jonas have anything to say?
No comment on this particular issue. It's
I think I made my comments on C-band.
Yep. Okay.
In the presentation.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you for that. Yes. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you. My name is Bengt Barud. I'm with the Swedish regulator, but I'm also chair for a working party at the OECD. I have a big question, or a big scale question. We have three sectors: satellite sector, aviation sector, and telecom operators. And these sectors use spectrum at different conditions. I mean, we have a national allocation for spectrum for operators, and then we have a satellite sector that, if they come first, they get spectrum at ITU, and the aviation sector is have spectrum. So if you look at the future into 6G or multi-layer network, three-dimensional network, so how do you see this playing out here? Different condition, different regulatory regimes on the national level. And then follow up on that, how to share all this spectrum to make more efficient use of this spectrum. So if you can give a picture on this future, thank you.
Okay. Does anyone would like to say? Martha again. Yes, you're very popular.
No, I was going to say that indeed you are completely right. At some point, it's not possible to clean every band, so we are pushed to sharing. And if we want to make a very efficient use of the spectrum, there are basically three options. One, to have more advanced technologies, like when we had digital TV instead of analog TV, and then we are using the same band but with higher quality and more efficient use of the spectrum. Other option is you go very high in frequencies, and that's because the technology allows us to do that. And then the third option is to share. I mean, there is no magic in that, and those that work on spectrum management know that very well. So it's absolutely true that every time it's harder to find bands that can be clean and that can be, the traditional process is planning, identification, clearance, assignment, and then enforcement. But there will be at some point, it won't be any more possible to go through clearance processes because that's expensive, that takes time, and that needs a lot of investment from someone to do that process. So spectrum sharing is coming and coming. Indeed, when I was referring to 3.8 to 4.2 gigahertz band, in my examples, it doesn't requires to clear the band. You don't need to clean it. You can have coexistence because your rules can make sure that incumbent services could be protected. And then I think there are some countries that are going even farther into that process. And for example, in the US now there are considerations from 3.1 gigahertz to 3.45 about how to address the future of that band. And there are services like radio location, and there are many usage of that band. And every time authorities and experts are pushed to find the right conditions for sharing. So I don't have a specific answer to a particular band for aviation, but I think that's the reality, as that's what we are facing more and more.
Thank you. Christopher?
Well, I mean, I cannot agree more. Spectrum sharing it has to be incentivized, encouraged. Spectrum is a limited resource, so the different industries, the different users have absolutely to share it. The problem is that there are some bands where, after going through a very extensive period of analysis of studies, the WRC cycle is a very good example of that. Within the ITUR groups, experts from many countries in the world, I wouldn't say from all over the world, but undertake for 3.5 to 4 years studies on precisely how services can be compatible, under which technical conditions and parameters they can coexist. And that's the way it should be, I believe. But at the same time, then the outcomes should be respected and not going back to discussions, debates that were settled and that evidence was provided, unless there is a clear technology breakthrough that allows for, let's say, the sharing of IMT and satellite services in the 28 gigahertz band or in the Ku band. That's not the case, right? That's not the case. So sharing, yes, but also after having done the technical studies, respecting the outcomes when sharing is clearly demonstrated that is not feasible.
Jonas?
Not much to add, really. I think maybe it doesn't address the question directly, but I think in many cases, well, we've seen cases in the past where, in particular in relation to IMT and those types of services, they generally, regardless of any sharing studies that have been done and conclusions, generally they require exclusive spectrum. So if a band has been identified for IMT, it's typically on a national basis made available for IMT exclusively, and it's difficult for let's say a satellite operator or anyone else to get access to the band. I mean, we've been displaced from various bands in certain locations because of that sort of situation. Even if, I mean, sharing is good, but at the end of the day, any type of sharing involves some kind of technical constraints. So if you want to have sharing, then all services will have to accept a level of constraint. And I think many times especially when you're dealing with bands where a lot of money is involved and operators are buying spectrum for huge sums of money, those operators won't accept any sharing constraints, and you end up having exclusive spectrum for those services.
Okay, and my own perspective, I think it is, as has been indicated, it is difficult, becoming increasingly difficult to find spectrum that could be given over exclusively to one service or another to introduce new applications, and sharing will have to be part of the solution going forward. And I think in terms of mobile systems, it's inevitable that spectrum will have to be shared because it's becoming more and more difficult to find new bands where there isn't an incumbent that's providing a very valuable service that that you could just move out of the way. But sharing requires compromises and acceptance on both sides. Both parties, the incumbent and the newcomer, need to think about how they coexist together and work out what the best overall approach to use of the band is. That's not easy, and it does require a bit of a mindset shift on all parties, to be honest, and it also requires studies, technical studies on coexistence, for instance, that are realistic and are not just worst case all of the time, but you really think through very hard about what realistically can be done, what's the absolute requirement for protection, not some theoretical number that that you pluck out of the air, but what do you really need, and where's the flexibility? So it will require a mindset shift, but it's inevitable because the spectrum is a very, very scarce resource, and we're trying to cram more and more intelligence services into it. Let's use a bit of that intelligence to enable a bit of sharing. Okay. Any further questions from the floor? Yes, gentleman here. Can we pass a microphone to the gentleman here? Has anyone got a microphone? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. I'm Mohammad Jahazeb from Ministry of IT and Telecom, Pakistan. I have a couple of questions, one from you, Martin, and then the other from Mr. Jonas. Mr. Jonas showed us, compared the total quantum of spectrum identified for IMT and being used. So can you identify those spectrum bands that are still not being used, for instance, in the UK or in the Arab world, that are identified but still not being used for IMT? Second.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I'll answer that question straight up. Not right now, but there is a report, as I referred to and I think that report is publicly available, so you could. That's one source to look at. Of course, as I said, that report is from 2019, so it's a few years old, and things may have changed a bit since then. But that's one source. I'm sure there are others, but that's the best I can offer at the moment. I can help you find that report if you like.
I would just say, you have to be careful when you're just saying something like, well, there's so much bandwidth of spectrum identified in the radio regulations for IMT, and look, it's not all used. Part of the reason for that is, of course, when you identify spectrum in the radio regulations, it may be that you've identified a wider bandwidth than any particular country would need, but it gives flexibility for that country to pick the particular part of the spectrum within that band that suits their needs and is available. And therefore, you might have, for instance, at 40 gigahertz, we identified, a lot of spectrum, but it was only ever on the basis that we thought, for instance, half of that might be used in Europe, but a different half would be used potentially in region 2, for instance. So just totting up and saying, well, it's only half used doesn't tell the story. But I do agree that the mobile industry needs to demonstrate why they need more when you go to answer questions about, well, should we give them more? And you have to say, well, are you using what's available locally as efficiently as possible? and what can you do, what other things can you do, rather than just identify more spectrum, is densification, for instance, of networks a viable alternative? And you need to explore the sort of pros and cons of various things before you say, well, actually, we need more spectrum. So I recognise what Jonas was saying, but it's not as simple as that from my perspective.
Martin, can I add something? I think, and I have noticed, I'm very glad you're here because you are the decision makers. And sometimes at the spectrum planning level, it seems to me that there are like two different visions. The team that is working on WRC and is working about spectrum planning and identifying more frequency bands for IMT or for any other service, and the team that is working on spectrum auctions and market and regulations of operations. And I think the two subjects are very related because, and I invite you to make that exercise in your country. How many of the frequency bands that have been identified that suit your country, because I agree, not every frequency band is appropriate for a particular country, that are appropriate for your country are ready, I mean, which bands could be ready to go to the market? And what I have heard, there is a good march there, because when you see the numbers and the penetration, I heard countries that say 37% of penetration, 39%, 50%. There is still, I mean, there are still other issues that are more than just IMT identification. There are issues about how to find the right business model for mobile operators, spectrum price, availability of devices. You know, there are so many other things involved. So my impression is that sometimes you are addressing one side that is important, of course, because you need long-term planning, but is not the main bottleneck in making sure that users and citizens can take advantage of IMT and mobile communications. And because sometimes all the attention is addressed there, other problems that are more important and more critical, and that, you know, these Murphy rules, sometimes you can address the 20% or you can address the 80%. So there, I think the challenge is not only keeping identifying a spectrum. That's one part, but it's also making sure that that spectrum is effectively used. And if you go to rural areas or underserved areas and you take a spectrum analyzer, there will be a lot of idle bands that are not used. So my invitation is, please take this as a holistic problem. You don't solve it just identifying more spectrum. It's important to make sure that that spectrum is really used by final users and that all technologies can provide what they have to provide for connectivity.
Thank you for that. Christopher, did you have anything to add? No? Okay. And you had a second question? Sorry, the gentleman before here.
Actually, you have answered it, because my question was, in the millimeter wave bands, the quantum of spectrum is too large, while in the lower bands, the quantum of spectrum per band is much lower. So if we aggregate and if we show that, you know, countries are using only 40% or 50%, that might not truly reflect the actual utilization of the.
Yeah.
So that's what you said, El.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you for that. Any other questions? Yes, at the front here.
Thank you. Once again, it might not really be a question, just a comment quickly. One probably to the CTO. I believe maybe in such panels later to consider also having the mobile industry represented in the panel. I see, if not from Dynamic Spectrum Alliance, the other two are satellite. So it's good to have that mix so that you look at the. So, and then the other thing, when they mentioned about the 26 gig, that has always been the problem for us in the developing world, in Africa, for example, or in Nigeria, for instance. We are sparsely populated.
Yep.
So if you have such spectrum that are not having the good propagation characteristics, it might be a waste of time. So if you are considering the millimeter wave band that was identified at the WRC 19 to be used by some African operator, it's going to take a very long time because the coverage is just 200 meters. So who has the money to continue putting 2 generators per site for 200 meters of coverage continuously. So it might not really work. And that's why probably you still see the issue of 6 to 24 probably still coming up, because we're looking for spectrum that has coverage, that you could have one site and you cover a lot. Despite the fact that in the millimeter wave, we have a lot of bandwidth. But in the mid bands also, you have a lot of bandwidth. So I also dare to say, like for us in Nigeria, we've utilized almost all the spectrum that have been given to IMT, apart from the millimeter wave. So in fact, we have even gone into those that have not even been identified by WRC, like the 3638. So we've licensed those also. So it's, I think, a case-by-case basis. Sometimes the population of countries would differ. Some countries don't have so much. They have not utilized their 3G spectrum up till now. They have not utilized the 4G spectrum. And when you even look at those spectrum, how much is it? 10 megahertz in the 800 per operator. So you are talking about 10 megahertz. It's only in the 2.6 that you can talk of higher bandwidth. So that's why we went for the C-band, where you have per operator 100 megahertz, and you could have a change in the dynamics. But thank them all. Again, want to state also, like the JSOA studies that were said, there are studies also by the mobile that had shown that sharing is feasible, on the 6 gigahertz band at the conference. So I believe we'll slug it out at the WRC.
Yeah, I think we will, and I think you're absolutely right when you look at, if you look at the economics of rolling out services in different countries with different geographies, with different issues, coverage and capacity, then you will make different decisions in regard to what's the appropriate set of frequencies you need at any one time. And it's not necessarily the case just because a band's been identified in the radio regulations. It's relevant for a local context, and so I think you're absolutely right, and you are also right that in particular with 6 gigahertz there are a range of different views on the sharing studies. Some studies show that sharing is possible, and other studies not, and it depends on what assumptions you've built in and what you're taking into account. So you need to look at those things very carefully, just not accept them at face value. You need to think about what they're actually telling you, what's actually being protected in this study versus that study. So I think you're right. We probably have time for one more question if anyone has one. Is there a final question anyone would like to ask? I can't see any hands raised. Was there anything the panel would want to say in conclusion? No? Well, thank you very much. I mean, I think this has been a really, really interesting panel. It's obvious that there's a lot of concern, both in terms of making the appropriate spectrum available for services, but also in protecting incumbent services, and how do you get the right balance with that? And it's not easy, I think. And things like taking sharing and how you might facilitate that. Personally, I think that's something that we need all to think about, and that requires a bit of a mind shift on lots of people's parts to make that reality. But I thank everyone for the very interesting questions. I thank the panel for their interesting presentations and their responses to the questions. So thank you very much.